For the vast majority of our history, human life was a local affair. People lived in small, disconnected villages where every hour of the day was dedicated to the mechanics of basic survival. But as these villages grew into cities and eventually into empires, a recurring pattern began to emerge. Across thousands of years, history shows that no matter how massive a state becomes, its grip on power is never permanent. Plotted over time, civilizations follow a consistent trajectory, a rapid ascent, a peak golden age, and an inevitable decline. To see this in action, we go back to 3000 BCE, to the first recorded civilizations in Mesopotamia. By identifying these 5 distinct phases, rise, expansion, peak, decline, and fall, we can see how every superpower in history, including those today, is influenced by the same social and economic pressures. This cycle found its first home between the Tigris and Euphrates. These rivers were unpredictable, but their floodwaters provided the fuel for the world's first urban centers in the region of Sumer. The Sumerians managed these rivers through a series of massive irrigation canals and used the newly invented wheel to move their harvests. These innovations produced the world's first food surpluses, allowing human groups to stop worrying about daily survival and start building a complex society. As their wealth grew, the Sumerians developed cuneiform, a system of wedge-shaped symbols pressed into clay. This wasn't for poetry, it was for accounting. By archiving debts, laws, and inventory, civilization could finally grow beyond the limits of human memory. While organized farming and writing gave birth to the first cities, they also created a central stockpile of wealth. These granaries and treasuries acted as a magnet for competition, drawing the attention of those who preferred to take wealth rather than grow it. Sargon of Akkad was the first to act on this opportunity. He used Sumer's accumulated food stores to feed a full-time army, using that military force to break through city walls and pull neighboring territories under a single centralized command. However, Akkad's growth was driven by continuous conquest. This strategy proved unstable. As soon as the expansion stopped, the empire burned through its resources and began a rapid decline. The civilization that followed, Babylon, took a different approach to holding power. They looked for a way to maintain control that didn't rely exclusively on the sword. King Hammurabi introduced the revolutionary idea of a centralized rule of law. He had his legal code etched into a stone pillar, making the rules of the empire public, permanent, and physically impossible to ignore. This legal order allowed trade to move safely between cities, fueling a massive golden age. Babylon expanded into an orderly grid of mud brick walls and massive infrastructure, becoming the most organized city on Earth. But the peak of the Golden Age often contains the seeds of its own end. This concentration of wealth made Babylon the ultimate target for the next power in the cycle. Out of the chaos of Mesopotamia's next decline, Assyria emerged with a brutal new strategy. They aimed to sustain their power through a policy of absolute psychological terror. They backed this up with technical escalations, using iron weapons and organized siege warfare. They became a disciplined military machine, capable of systematically breaking any city that resisted them. This efficiency allowed the Assyrians to push their borders from the Persian Gulf all the way to the Mediterranean, creating a territory far larger than any of the empires that had come before. But this model had a fatal flaw. Ruling by fear requires an immense, continuous supply of resources to suppress constant revolts. The intense internal pressure of managing millions of angry subjects eventually exceeded what the Assyrian military could control. The Assyrian Empire eventually shattered because the same brutality that had expanded its borders also forced its enemies to unite. When the center finally weakened, the surrounding nations moved in together to tear it apart. When Cyrus the Great founded the Persian Empire, the state adopted a model that solved many of the problems that had destroyed Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria. To fix the problem of communication across such a massive distance, they built the Royal Road. This logistical network connected distant provinces, allowing information and trade to move faster than ever before. More importantly, Persia replaced Assyrian terror with a policy of tolerance. They protected diverse religions and cultures within their borders, creating a unified empire that people actually wanted to belong to. By combining Babylonian-style law with unprecedented infrastructure and cultural acceptance, Persia reached a peak of human civilization that lasted for centuries. Even with these brilliant innovations, the Persian Empire remains subject to the same life cycle as the others. These repeating curves show that every superpower eventually faces its own decline. It is a continuous loop. Once an empire reaches its peak, the map is eventually cleared to make room for a new power to begin its own rise. For the Persians, that new power was already rising in the West. A different kind of civilization was forming in the mountains of Greece, led by a young king named Alexander. This map illustrates the Persian Empire at height, governing a landmass that completely dwarfs the Greek peninsula. Zooming in on the threat, we see independent, fractured city-states sitting directly in the path of a unified Persian expansion. By utilizing their narrow mountain passes and coastal geography, Greek defenders managed to halt the Persian advance at Thermopylae and Salamis, winning through tactical discipline despite the overwhelming gap in manpower. These victories secured a fragile period of autonomy for the region, effectively stopping Persian momentum at the edge of Europe. The survival of these city-states kept a specific set of political and military ideas alive, ideas that would eventually provide the blueprint for a counteroffensive against the Persian superpower a century later. In this post-war environment, Athens saw an explosion of philosophy and science, constructing monuments like the Parthenon that defined the architectural peak of the era. But the same independence that fueled their culture also fueled their rivalries. Decades of internal wars eventually exhausted the Greek city-states, leaving the region militarily depleted. This created an opening for the Kingdom of Macedonia to the north. Under King Philip II, Macedonia began a rapid campaign to fill this power vacuum. Philip's success relied on a specific military evolution, the phalanx. By organizing soldiers into tight blocks armed with 6-meter spears, he used superior reach and density to forcefully unite the Greek states under Macedonian control. Philip took the engineering and tactical discipline developed in the Greek wars and centralized them, turning a collection of fractured militias into a single professional military machine. When Philip's son Alexander took the throne, he used that machine to launch a massive invasion into the heart of the Persian Empire. Alexander's campaign was defined by high-speed engineering. During the siege of Tyre, his engineers built a massive stone causeway through the ocean, allowing siege towers to reach an island fortress that had previously been considered unreachable by land. As he moved through Egypt, he founded Alexandria, positioning it as a strategic hub for trade and the collection of global knowledge. The Persian administration eventually collapsed under the weight of these defeats, and Alexander claimed the empire's crown for himself. However, the campaign finally stalled in India. Pushed into heavy monsoon rains and unfamiliar jungles, his soldiers mutinied, refusing to march any further. While Alexander could conquer land as fast as his army could march, the physical and mental endurance of his men set the final boundary for his empire's expansion. When Alexander died unexpectedly in Babylon, his empire immediately fractured. This map shows how his generals divided the territory into competing regions, each guarded by new, rigid borders. While the political unity vanished, the Greek language, mathematics, and scientific methods his army brought with them remained rooted in every province from the Mediterranean to the Indus River. These cultural ideas proved more durable than the political borders that initially spread them, creating a shared intellectual language that would survive for centuries. As the Greek-led empires in the East began to decline, a new power was emerging on the Italian peninsula. Rome was building a republic focused on rigid discipline and permanent infrastructure, like these stone roads. Rome began a methodical expansion, slowly absorbing the weakened territories and resources left behind by the fragments of Alexander's empire. This graph plots a repeating pattern: rise, expansion, peak, decline, and fall. This cycle has defined the life cycle of every superpower we've looked at so far. Rome is currently in a phase of aggressive expansion, but its path to regional dominance is about to be challenged by an equal rival. To survive and reach its peak, Rome would have to face a power from North Africa, a general named Hannibal, and his army of war elephants. When the Roman Empire finally fragmented, it left behind more than just stone ruins. It left a power vacuum that stretched across the known world. The millennium from 500 to 1500 CE was a period of intense incubation for a new class of global superpower. Far beyond the borders of Europe, 5 distinct giants were taking shape: the Mali, the Mongols, the Ottomans, the Aztecs, and the Incas. This thousand-year era demonstrates how the foundations of the modern world were built by centers of power far outside of Europe. To understand the current global map, we have to look at the civilizations that dominated the 1,000 years between Rome and the colonial age. These 5 empires were divided by massive geographic barriers: lethal deserts, uncharted oceans, and unscalable mountain ranges. Because of these distances, each civilization had to unlock its own specialized trait to survive and eventually dominate its region. However, despite having entirely different geographic advantages and specialized strengths, every single one of them eventually succumbed to the exact same cycle. What were these 5 master traits, and why was none of them powerful enough to stop a civilization's inevitable collapse? We start in West Africa with the Mongol Empire. To grow, they first had to navigate the Sahara, an environment that served as a near-impenetrable wall for most other civilizations. Mali succeeded by weaponizing the geography. By controlling the vital desert wells and caravan routes, they monopolized the flow of salt and gold, transforming a wasteland into a massive economic engine. This wealth funded a cultural peak. Under Mansa Musa, the city of Timbuktu became a global center for libraries and mosques, defined by its sophisticated and distinct mud brick architecture. But the same gold that built the empire eventually invited its destruction. The concentration of wealth attracted relentless pressure from rival kingdoms, determined to seize the trade routes for themselves. Wealth alone cannot sustain an empire if its borders become too fractured to defend the commerce that created it. Moving to the Asian steppes, Genghis Khan's empire relied on a different master trait: extreme mobility. In a landscape defined by flat, endless grasslands, speed was the only currency that mattered. By organizing their entire society around horse-mounted warfare, a nomadic people rapidly forged the largest contiguous land empire in history. This expansion effectively unified the East-West Silk Road under a single authority, allowing trade to flow safely across entire continents. However, the empire's scale soon exceeded its ability to communicate. A system built on speed struggled to manage the slow, complex demands of a massive, settled population. While rapid expansion wins wars, it cannot maintain long-term unity. Without a centralized bureaucracy, the empire eventually fractured into isolated khanates. The Ottoman state in Anatolia took a different path, focusing on aggressive territorial expansion and the consolidation of military power. Their master trait was military technology. In 1453, they used advanced gunpowder artillery to breach the stone walls of Constantinople, defenses that had been considered impregnable for a millennium. This technological edge allowed the Ottomans to expand their influence across 3 continents: Europe, Asia, and North Africa. But relying on a technological lead is a precarious strategy. Over time, the empire's internal system stagnated, and as neighboring rivals began to modernize their own militaries, the Ottoman advantage vanished. Once a technological superpower is matched by its rivals, it often collapses from the weight of its own internal pressures. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs demonstrated extreme adaptability. They engineered a massive, highly organized capital city built directly on a lake, using a complex system of causeways and canals to manage a growing population. Further south in the Andes, the Inca Empire faced a different challenge: verticality. They lived in an environment where oxygen was thin and the terrain was almost entirely rock. Their master trait was unparalleled mountain engineering. They built a sprawling road network and peak-top cities with stonework so precise it required no mortar to withstand earthquakes. Yet neither Aztec administration nor Incan engineering could withstand the sudden arrival of Spanish steel, lethal foreign diseases, and internal civil wars. Even the most brilliant structural achievements cannot protect an empire from unprecedented external shocks. Trade, speed, technology, administration, and engineering. These were the 5 superpowers of the medieval world.
but history shows that no single trait guarantees survival. This graph illustrates the universal pattern that eventually claimed them all: the cycle of rise, expansion, peak, and inevitable decline. Global power rarely disappears entirely. Instead, the infrastructure and wealth one empire built shifts to the next system that is ready to emerge. As these 5 medieval giants faded, they left a vacuum. The fall of these land-based powers set the stage for European sailing ships to cross the Atlantic, marking the beginning of the colonial era.
For centuries, human civilizations operated within rigid limits, pinned in place by towering geography and localized technological plateaus. This isolation dissolved in the late 15th century as European powers pushed past their traditional borders, weaponizing new maritime tools to chase concentrated wealth. This initial momentum defines the rise, a period where naval navigation transforms the ocean from a lethal barrier into a high-speed trade route. The first ships crossing the Atlantic pulled previously isolated kingdoms into a singular, interconnected system of global growth and competition. This momentum naturally accelerates into expansion. The curiosity of early exploration immediately gives way to a calculated industrial-scale extraction of resources. Silver, gold, and lucrative crops began flowing back to Europe in a constant stream, providing the massive capital needed to fund further global dominance. A handful of small nations optimized their military firepower and trade networks to establish control over territories many times their own size. Across distant coastlines, this control took physical form: the rapid construction of stone forts, colonial warehouses, and permanent trading posts. This outward push wasn't a choice, it was a requirement. The imperial model functions like a machine that must constantly find new inputs to sustain its own weight. Imperial reach eventually hits a peak. In the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution accelerated this process further, using heavy steam and rail to push into previously unreachable interiors. This sudden technological surge led directly to the scramble for Africa, where European powers partitioned an entire continent in less than 30 years. We see the results of this partition on this map. Note the ruler-straight geometric lines drawn by diplomats to divide these claims. These boundaries were drawn for the convenience of resource extraction, ignoring the existing ethnic territories and indigenous sovereignty of the people living there. At the height of this era, the British Empire expanded until it physically occupied nearly 1/4 of the world's landmass. But an empire of this scale creates friction at every border. By reaching its maximum extent, the system became too large and expensive to defend. This leads to decline. When the cost of maintaining a global border exceeds the wealth extracted from it, the imperial system begins to fracture. The sheer economic and military exhaustion of 2 world wars shattered the strength of the colonizers, leaving their overseas possessions vulnerable. Simultaneously, colonized populations across the globe organized into powerful resistance and independence movements to reclaim their own governance. This photograph captures that internal pressure. These protesters weren't just asking for change, they were demanding specific institutional shifts, from fresh elections to the end of emergency rule. History shows that when a system's overhead exceeds its output, it eventually collapses. The colonial era proved that even the most advanced military cannot maintain infinite expansion on a finite planet. The final phase is legacy. Even after the political government of an empire dies, the physical and digital networks it built often survive. As the map was redrawn, dozens of new national flags rose across Asia and Africa, marking a massive global wave of decolonization. Global power shifted toward multinational institutions and trade networks, replacing direct military conquest with diplomatic and economic connection. Today's world of independent nations still operates along the trade routes and technological pathways established by those fallen empires. When we zoom out to look at 5,000 years of data, a consistent pattern emerges across every civilization we've tracked since 3000 BCE. Whether Rome or the British Empire, they all follow the same trajectory: rise, expansion, peak, decline, and a lasting legacy.
What endures is the human progress, the ideas, scientific instruments, and cultures that move through these networks even after the governments that built them disappear. The data suggests that empires are temporary structures that eventually outgrow their foundations. History repeats this cycle, but with every iteration, the shared knowledge of humanity continues to grow.